Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Fabulous. So I've been an Office fan since like 2006. It's definitely been a while. And one thing I feel like I've really seen change in that time is people's responses to the Jim and Pam characters, especially Jim. I don't remember many people saying that they hated him back when the show was on, especially when it was in its prime before like season 6 or so. But over the past few years, it feels like it's become really popular to bash the guy, with endless articles being written about how his pranks were actually really mean, he's judgmental, kind of a jerk, etc. And look, I do not hate Jim Halpert. I think he's an important anchor in the show. But when going back and viewing the series as a whole, I think I understand where those reactions are coming from. So that's what I want to talk about this week. Everyone's favorite, or maybe least favorite, paper salesman from Scranton and how he fundamentally changed throughout the show's run. To zoom out and really talk about Jim's role on the show, I think we actually need to talk about his British counterpart first, Tim Canterbury. I think the differences between the two are interesting and pretty important to note. In so many ways, these are the same characters. At the start of their stories, they both feel lost, at a job that they find boring and pretty soul-crushing. They both have ridiculous bosses, a crush on the receptionist, and sit near an obnoxious coworker who they play light pranks on. But there is definitely still some key differences. The main one being that Tim's life is just much more sad and desperate than Jim's ever seems to be. Maybe that's putting it bluntly, but there's no real way around it. There would never be an episode of The American Office where Jim is completely humiliated in front of Pam as Michael, Dwight, and Todd Packer pull off his shoes and throw them over a building, leaving Jim to just walk home alone in his socks. But that's exactly what happens to Tim in the third episode of the UK Office, as Chris Finch, the original Todd Packer, just bullies him endlessly. Even in the early seasons, Jim is a cool guy. He kind of floats above everything, smirking his way through the day before going home to a fairly nice apartment that he shares with a roommate. And that just isn't Tim, who seems much more depressed, who hates that he still lives with his parents at 30 years old, and who has much more skin in the game when it comes to the indignity and cruelty he has to put up with at work. Todd Packer may be based on Chris Finch, but how he relates to Jim is very different. Where Jim might just roll his eyes at Packer's lame, retrograde sense of humor, Finch kind of terrorizes Tim. It's a much more stressful dynamic. Tim is relatable and in many ways our audience surrogate just like Jim, but crucially, he's not cool or particularly confident. The American Office took Tim and transformed him into a more standard sitcom leading man. Which isn't to say that I think they ruined the character or anything. The American Office is just going for a lighter, less bleak tone than the original show. And I think that's okay, because this version of the show still really goes out of its way to show us how trapped Jim feels in his job. The early episodes especially really underline that, and it's that lovable underdog status that keeps him from coming across as unbearably smug. In those first few seasons, Michael is often so thoughtless and Dwight so ridiculous that Jim's pranks and smirks feel more than deserved. But over time, something happened to the rest of the cast that I think really ended up hurting Jim in the end. In season 1, Michael could be genuinely cruel. He was a nightmare of a boss, with only a few of the positive qualities that the writers would create for him later. The show started playing more to Steve Carell's strengths in the second season, while still keeping Michael as a pretty terrible guy to work for. In that context, Jim's whole shtick still worked really well. But as the show went on, both Michael and Dwight softened. They were still very goofy people, but they were also much more likable, with plenty of moments of real warmth and kindness. And at the same time that was happening, the show was becoming a bit more cartoonish, including Jim's pranks. So over time, those pranks started to come off less as a fun moment of relief from the drudgery of the office and the awful behavior of Michael and Dwight, and more like some smug, cool guy picking on a lovable loser. And I think that extended beyond Dwight too. Even as early as season 3, I think you can see Jim become a bit less likable. In episode 14, The Return, he steals Andy's phone and puts it in the ceiling panel above his desk. When Andy can't find it, he has a total meltdown, which ends in him punching a hole in the wall. I thought I remembered this episode really well because it's a good one. But one moment I had totally forgotten about until I rewatched it recently was Jim and Pam looking at that hole in the wall later and kind of laughing to themselves about it. I mean, I get it, Andy is a fairly annoying character, and they set up that his ringtone was annoying everyone, but I just don't think Jim comes off well here. They both feel really smug and mean-spirited in this scene, which I don't think was really the show's intention. As the show continues, Jim is promoted to a boss and loses even more of that everyman quality that he had early on. Now, to be fair, this is kind of what they did with Tim too in the second series of the BBC show, but there it felt very purposeful. There's a great scene at the end of the first series where he gets promoted and starts talking to Dawn in like this totally empty corporate speak, mirroring the exact kind of thing that they used to make fun of together. There's not much commentary like that with Jim. It just sort of feels like they needed to show the character was making progress, so they put him in a suit. I don't think it really worked. I think Jim is just kind of at his most boring in his boss era on the show. I wouldn't say he became unlikable exactly, but definitely a lot more dull. The tension that he had with Pam and the desperation he felt working a job that seemed pointless was slowly fading away. I think the show realized this was a mistake and pulled back on the whole boss angle, but it didn't really fix things, because at that point, the stuff that made the character who he was early on were kind of gone. Then there's the Jim we get in the post-Michael era. I really think if the show had ended in like season 7, we wouldn't see the hate for Jim that he gets now. The show had really run out of things for him and Pam to do at this point. The will they or won't they romance was pretty far in the rearview mirror, and even exciting character changes like Pam joining the Michael Scott Paper Company were over and done with. The show spent so much of its run selling us on this fairy tale romance, but the happy ending had already happened, making it really hard to find interesting things to do with them. And what they settled on for Jim is just not great. Athlete, later renamed Athleap, is a sports marketing company that Jim invests in with Daryl, and it feels completely wrong for the show. And I totally understand what the writers were going for here. They felt that Jim and Pam deserved something better than boring old Dunder Mifflin, so they wanted to end the show by sending him off to an amazing job. But to me, nothing could be farther from the real spirit of The Office than Jim shooting hoops with NBA legends. Over time, The Office transformed itself into a show about cartoonish best buddies who just so happened to work at a paper company. But I think what it was at its best, and what the original show was about, was characters trying to find some meaning and hope in the boring absurdity of low-level corporate work life. In the UK Office, and the early seasons of the US one, there's so much emphasis placed on pointless, boring meetings that are clearly a waste of everyone's time. Almost everyone knows that they're in the twilight, dying years of an industry that didn't really excite them in the first place. But a job is a job, so they show up every day and take the small amounts of humanity and real connection that they can get. At the end of the day, there's a real sense of melancholy and sadness that I think got lost over the years. And things like the Athleap storyline are a perfect encapsulation of that. By the end of The Office, there's not an ounce of that original Tim character left in Jim. He's a cool guy who heads up an Austin startup and hangs out with celebrities. I'm okay with a happy ending. It's what I expect from a sitcom, and that's totally fine. But The Office was once a show that prided itself on being a little bit more grounded than most. So this total wish fulfillment ending for Jim and Pam always felt like the show betraying the tone of those seasons that I loved the most. So at the end of the day, do I agree that Jim is some terrible, hateable guy? No. Again, I like Jim Halpert. But the longer the show went on, the more I could feel him changing from the struggling character with one foot firmly rooted in the world of Tim Canterbury to your average sitcom leading man, who no longer deals with any of the day-to-day life problems that the show was based around. For me, the problem was never Jim Halpert. It was the show slowly transforming him into a lesser version of himself. I'd really like to thank this week's sponsor, Fabulous, for supporting the channel. This past week or so, I've been trying out their app for the first time, and I gotta say, it really is a game changer. Whether it's physical or mental health, mindfulness, or the ability to really focus on your goals, there's something that I'm sure all of us wish we could be doing better. I get distracted by social media really easily and can waste hours on there, so meeting deadlines isn't always easy. And that's where Fabulous came in. This is an app that's all about building healthy habits that stick. There's definitely a lot of changes I'd like to make, and this helps me take real steps to do just that. Big changes can feel a little overwhelming, but Fabulous uses behavioral science that helps me break down these daily habit changes into really manageable tasks that not only feel doable, but also give me a nice sense of accomplishment as I make progress. And unlike so many other apps, it's all at your own pace. I started with Fabulous pretty recently, but I'm already excited about the changes that I'm making, especially when it comes to eating better and just using the hours in my day to actually get stuff done, instead of procrastinating. The premium membership is really great and gives you access to so many ways to personalize your self-improvement journey. So to start improving your daily habits right now, go to thefab.co/captainmidnight. The first 100 people who click on the link will get 25% off a Fabulous premium subscription. So go to thefab.co/captainmidnight and start building your ideal daily habits today.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.